All right, we are live. Welcome to Climate Courage. My name is Andrea Edwards.
My name is Steve Johnson, and despite the difference in name, I'm the proud husband of Miss Andrea Edwards.
Thanks, Dales. So one of the discussions that you and I have been having a lot over quite a few years now is how do we prepare financially for a future where there's no real clear answers of what's coming, when it's coming, how we're going to be affected, who's going to be affected. And, everything seems to be escalating. The predictions aren't looking good. So from a financial perspective, what's your big unknown?
I think it's how do we plan for something that we don't know what's going to look like in a few years' time? Because as with most things, there's different data points and different bits of information that we can gather. But how do we get ourselves ready for that to hopefully cover all the options? And I don't know if I'm an engineer by background. I don't know if that sort of drives that need to plan and need to have a path forward. But as we were just talking about, I found it really, really uncomfortable last few months and sort of not having that foundation, not knowing what that future looks like.
I think that's a good question. Yeah, I think that's a tough thing, especially I think for men who've been raised to take care of the family, be the protectors, that sort of traditional mindset in all cultures. I think that's a big issue. For me, it's even things like, do we have cash in our safe, and if we do have cash, what currency? Like, is currency going to be a thing? And then, we're looking at societal collapse. So what does that look like? And then the other side is, where do we buy property? Do we go south to Australia? The only place that's looking good is Tasmania. Do we go north to the UK, Scotland? That's not looking good either if the AMOC goes. So we're struggling with it. And I know that a lot of other couples and families are struggling with this. So to get our heads around it, we decided to invite back two fantastic people, and that is Dr. David Coe and Richard Busellato. Welcome back.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having us back.
It is very early morning for you, and I'm sorry about that. But I think, getting that message out into the Asia and Asia Pacific region is important too, right? Because there's a lot going on up north, but not so much out in these parts. But anyway, so just if you haven't met Richard and David before, they wrote this book called The Unsustainable Truth, and how investing for the future is destroying the planet and what to do about it. And I have to tell you, I've almost finished it. It's such a fantastic book. It is what I don't expect people from financial backgrounds to be great storytellers, but you're both excellent storytellers. It's very philosophical, but I think the most powerful thing that I took away from it was an understanding of the global economy and how it works, as well as its history. It's a phenomenal book, and I recommend everyone gets a copy. So yeah, I hope it's going well, getting in front of the people you want it to get in front of.
Well, we'll now. Thank you.
And thank you so much for the kind words.
No, that's true. All right. So let's kick off. So in recent weeks, we've heard that 1.5 is gone, and a lot of people are saying 2 is probably gone as well. That is in 2 degrees global warming, which is catastrophic for humanity and all life on Earth. And there's an expectation that we're heading to 2.8, 2.4 if we're a little bit good and basically follow what we promised in Paris. I've been reading about permafrost collapse. So that used to be something that used to happen over decades. It'd just be a slow trickle. Now it's happening where massive areas of land are basically just collapsing. And, it's taking forests with it, which, of course, the CO2 is lost. These huge lakes are forming in these permafrost areas. And then yesterday in Europe, apart from rising rates in the UK, we found out that Europe is rising twice as fast as the rest of the world. And we know that the Arctic and Antarctica is rising 8 times as fast. By all accounts, we're in trouble, big trouble. So, but before we get into the finances, there's one area of concern that I consistently have. Every conversation I have, the time frame that people are thinking about for when this is coming is 2030, 2050, 2100. And as far as I can see from everything I'm reading, everything I'm witnessing and experiencing, the calamity is already here and it's going to progressively get worse. I was just reading about famine. By 2023, we're going to have all sorts of trouble. So give us an idea of what you think the timeline is, because you might be different to me.
Well, I mean, the timeline, if you take this year as an example, we've had a huge cost of living crisis everywhere. Fuel prices have gone up everywhere along, and that's largely driven it. Food prices have gone up all over the place, and so on. The story of this as being from the war with Ukraine is actually wrong.
Yeah.
If you look at that story about Russian energy, Russian oil, gas, and coal, you would think that we've seen huge shortages in oil, gas, and coal. It turns out that oil production has increased by about the same as what it always does every year, which is about 1% or so. Coal production has gone up by about another 1%, which is supposed to have been going down. Russia has been producing the most actually energy efficient coal, and that hasn't actually particularly stopped along the way. We've increased our coal production. Gas production has slowed down, but not from what you think of if you follow the European press about nobody using Russian gas anymore. It's only gone down by 0.5%. And so what the situation is actually hydroelectricity has been shut off because of climate change. Nuclear power has been affected by the fact that rivers have run dry in France and they can't cool the reactors.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're seeing is that you've got a huge demand for energy coming from everybody trying to do things to mitigate climate change, because when you want to build a wind turbine, you're going to need a lot of energy to dig that stuff out of the ground to be able to convert it into copper that you need to have the wires to carry the electricity that hopefully you get and all the rest of it. And if you want to build the metaverse, you still need copper wires so far, because you can try the fibers, but that isn't everywhere. So all of our activities is putting huge demands on everything. And the other side of it, if you look at food, you mentioned famine. I was quite shocked to find that basically there was a report that China has basically spent all the money they can to buy food from America, to buy grain from America. Not because they bought a lot, but because the prices have gone up so much. And the prices have gone up so much is because the grains are transported through rivers in America, and the major rivers have run dry. So the transportation costs have gone up huge amounts. So what's going on is we look at the geophysical things that you talk about, but the economic side of it, basically the economy being all about our livelihoods, basically. Everything we do for our livelihoods is what makes the economy. That side of it is feeling the effects of climate change first. And it's hitting everybody around the world. We were talking, Richard and I, yesterday. We've been borrowing from the planet for centuries, and increasingly so over the past few decades. And climate change is coming back to us like a loan shark, saying, you borrowed all of this, you got to pay back now. And if you are rich yourself, you've probably got siblings who aren't quite so much, and they're feeling it, got friends who are feeling it. And the thing with loan sharks is it doesn't matter how rich you get, the interest compound up and you can never pay unless you really face it and say, I've got to do something about how I live. So the answer to what you're describing is absolutely here now. It's hitting our economy before we feel it in the geophysical effects.
What a great analogy. Climate change is a loan shark. I love that.
Yeah.
Of course we've been borrowing from the planet.
We've been borrowing.
Of course we have. I love that. That's great.
I think that's pretty much how it works, actually. Like David said, we've been squeezing the planet effectively now into submission because we demand too much. And we have no way really of restraining ourselves from keep on asking for more, because there's so much things we want to do. And everyone makes a good case for why my needs are the ones that needs to be satisfied at the expense of everyone else. I'm not going to restrain my own demand on the planet. And the planet is rebelling. It's for everyone to see. This is what it's an unruly child who doesn't want to be told to do his bed up. It's going to rebel.
Yeah. All right. So I think we're all in agreement. So those conversations that I have with people, like I'm not trying to freak people out. I just want people to be aware, because when you're aware, you can start to make the decisions and take the actions that you need to take to protect yourself, your family, your community. And that's where we are. You know, I keep saying to everyone, if you haven't got a garden, start one. If you live in an apartment complex, start a community garden. Like, we need to be focusing on food security, right? Because that's going away. And, you know, places, you know, friends of mine in Singapore haven't seen any empty supermarket shelves yet. We've been seeing them for a couple of years, but this year's been much worse than previously. So, yeah, it's now. All right, Steve, you want to lay out our scenarios?
Yes. So for the benefit of everybody hopefully watching, what we wanted to ask you two guys was your thoughts on two specific scenarios that we'd like to model, both regarding sort of like family units, little bit sort of extremes in terms of the level of preparation. But the idea is what would be your advice for these two different scenarios? So the first one, let's say it's a family with kids. Let's say they've followed the traditional planning for retirement model. They got on the property ladder reasonably early, maybe own a number of properties, maybe in a number of different countries. Kids are close to finishing school. There's provisions put aside maybe for college / university / technical training college fund, pensions, PEPs, superannuation, following the traditional kind of route of preparing for that time in life where they are empty nesters, and they rely on their previous actions for their income going forward into the future. And they probably have a plan to pass some of that along to their kids as well. Second scenario we'd like you to consider is, again, a family unit that's maybe taken an untraditional path. I mean, by nowadays, the definition will be digital nomads, in being able to live in multiple different areas for a number of different reasons. Still financially fluid, well off by most explanations in most sort of cultures. Kids are in school, but they have not been paying into pensions, superannuation. Instead, they've kind of been sort of reacting to different events, moving to different countries. So there isn't that big traditional kind of nest egg, but they are fluid, if you like, liquid rather, in that they do have money, but it's not tied up in assets. Looking at these two scenarios, what would be your advice for both of those? I mean, everything comes into play. Is it currencies that need to be looked at? What type of currency? Is it something more portable like gold that's going to be worth more? Luxury goods. I mean, everyone hears about high-end luxury goods being a good way to transport money across borders without too much credibility, without too much scrutiny.
Although we did see recently in China that the value of things like Rolexes and luxury items have fallen off the cliff recently. So, that was another sort of like, interesting.
Yeah.
I think it's, for us, it's probably good to give a very short description of where we come from. We both worked in the investment industry for 30 odd years. And I started in 94. My girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, was going to Japan to look for a job, and we couldn't afford the phone bill. So I had to leave a university career where I was a lecturer at Oxford in physics to go and find a job somewhere else. And got invited into a hedge fund, which turned out to be the dream team of hedge funds. And actually it's been and stayed in that career since. But the thing I learned from that was very much about the fact that you have to be very careful about overextending the capacity of whatever it is that helps you to keep your life going in many ways. Because in the first job that I had, we were so successful and we thought so wonderful about it that in 97, we saw that it was getting harder to make money. We were making 40% a year kind of thing, right? So everybody was following us thinking we were brilliant. And we were doing that with basically making money every month to build up to it. So there's like, no down months, just money up all the way. And we saw the getting more difficult to keep that up. So what we did is gave back half the money. We gave back, we had billions at a time, which back in 97 was huge for a fund. And we gave back half the money. And the next year, we blew the world out because we doubled up our leverage by giving out half the money. And we found that actually we hit a bump in the road. Russia defaulted, if you remember that time, on its domestic debt. The world market started worrying about it. People started taking money back to keep it safe. So things that make sense from an investment perspective no longer make sense for people to hold because they just want to be safe. And then what you end up with is all sorts of borrowing and things ends up being in trouble. And we blew the world out literally so much that the Federal Reserve Bank of America locked 14 of the biggest banks in the world in a room with us and said, sort it out, door isn't opening until you do. And that's what sorted it out.
Yeah.
And so that was my experience, and Richard can give his. Well, 500% interest rates is.
Yeah, I started working in 1990, but thanks to an internship in the autumn of '89, this is actually the 5th decade I've been involved in financial markets, which always sounds incredibly impressive because they think of you as an 80-year-old, but I'm not quite there yet. So I grew up in Sweden via Brussels. I ended up in London 25 years ago. I've been involved really in only one thing my whole life, which is managing various types of financial portfolios. And like David said, in 1992, which is within days of the 30-year anniversary at the moment, actually, the European currency system, ERM as it was called, came under a lot of pressure because it was clear that the peripheral countries struggled to keep up with German productivity effectively. And in the UK, it was the Black Wednesday with Norman Lamont singing in the bath when Sterling finally got kicked out. And the Club Med countries in UK didn't really have a lot of appetite for pain and defending their currency. Sweden opted for a different route. So Sweden, in progressive steps, hiked their interest rates to 500% over the autumn of 1992. That has quite serious implications for people with floating mortgages. You pay something like 1.3% per day of the value of your house if you're 100% mortgaged. So it wasn't quite that bad because floating is not daily interest, but it got incredibly expensive and not totally unexpected. We had a huge housing crash in Scandinavia, Sweden in particular. What it does teach you when you're sitting in kind of the hot seat and you're managing money in that kind of environment is that no matter how much buffer and leeway you think you've got to really, really extreme events, it's never quite enough. Because Mr. Market can teach you awful lessons for people who are really sailing close to the wind all the time. And 500%, you cannot plug that into any model and think this can happen because it's such an outrageous move that no one was able to really to predict it or capture the magnitude of such a defense of the krona. At the end, they had to capitulate and Sweden devalued like everyone else. But they put up a fight for months that basically took the country into a full-blown, very nasty recession. There was a lot of political unity at the time, actually, not to let the currency speculants force us out. But like I said, that gives you a whole other perspective on risks that you're running. And you should never let any kind of event bankrupt you. That's really the life lesson I learned from that experience. No matter how much leeway you have, make sure you got more margin, because otherwise you do face the risk of bankruptcy when you get hit with really extreme events.
So I think back to the question, the two scenarios that you have, from our experience is really one that says it's not about trying to predict how the world is going to be. It's actually asking, if it doesn't work out to how you want it to be, or you fear it to be, or whatever it is, are you going to be taken out of the game? So we very much take it from that side. I learned my lesson right when I started in this place that was doing so well. Everybody was bending over backwards to be with us along. We had the Bank of Italy as one of our strategic partners. is that kind of reputable in that way. But reputation and all of your investment savvy and everything doesn't stop the world from becoming however it is going to be. And you can never really foresee how it is. It is more about, are you doubling down on an idea? Are you actually arguing your way to say, oh, it's going to be like this, and getting yourself so fixed on it that you're not actually asking, what happens if I'm wrong? And that's the side that we come from. That's the side why we end up leaving the investment industry, because we actually see climate change as something very real. And the reason we do that is because you can't sidestep climate change. And the only way to be able to do the things that we genuinely need to do is to make sure that, first of all, we can be secure ourselves, because only that way are we going to have that fortitude to stay the path and the courage to do the right thing along the way. We can't see ourselves as being secure, as you're describing. If I take those two kind of couples as examples, whatever it is, if they start worrying too much about how they're going to be, if they end up spending all their time being anxious about not being able to find their space, they'll never be able to, first of all, hold on to their view. The other side of it is that will mean they'll never have the courage to actually tackle the real issues that drive climate change at the moment. So those are really important questions for us. I identify myself very much with the first example. I've had very good years. We have time there. The first thing I've done, and I'll use myself as an example to that because I identify very much to it, is I actually don't consider, and I talk to my wife about this a lot, I actually don't consider our wealth as being at all stable in the world to come. We've basically upfronted our inheritance. You mentioned the inheritance with our children and said, that's all you can manage. The rest of us, we're going to live and spend, basically. And that's an important element also with climate, because if we simply take out the resources we need and spend it all and effectively give it all back, then you're neutral to the world. We've grown in the past, probably since the 70s especially, with this idea that somehow we want to leave our children a step up. The world we're facing, we don't know what that step up really means. That's the part they need to find for themselves. So the greatest inheritance I can give them is the courage to do that. That element of courage that, Andrea, you talk about very much. That's the greatest inheritance for them. The money side, don't fixate on whether they've got enough from the money side, because whatever it is, it probably isn't going to be enough. But the courage part of it will mean that even if there isn't any of it, they will find a way.
Right. Do you foresee a potential for that future where that inheritance that you talked about, that you maybe put a figure on it of X, do you see the potential for that inheritance to be X minus 50%, 40%, 80%, that nest egg that you plan for? Do you see that possible potential risk, I guess?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I see it as again, for myself, so we have property. We've been very fortunate. We've been able to have property, and we bought the properties back in sort of the 90s. So we've ridden along, and as someone I hired not long ago in the job I was at before was talking about how his parents, they're so proud of their investment savvy of having bought the property, and he was saying, but it was just they just happened to have been there. There was no decision, no savvy in that way. You just on this floating tide along in there. That tide can turn. And so in terms of that X and whatever it is, what I think of between myself and my wife is we're going to spend what we have saved. We're going to end up doing that. The chances are it's not going to be enough. So that goes down to this other part. And this part, actually, I had this kind of realization in a way. It's a subtle feeling we all have, but it was brought into words through the lyrics of a song. And it was because my mum, who's 87, and she's kind of she had a stroke. She can't move very easily. She's basically blind because of glaucoma and things. But through the hospital she goes to, there's a singing group called VIP Singers, visually impaired singers, all very important people. And they were singing the theme song to Cheers, which is an old sitcom. And it talks about we all want to be in a place where everybody knows our name, where our troubles are all the same. And that's the element that kind of sums up, away from the money, that path we would like. We don't want to be left out somewhere where actually we're on our own. And in the world and the problems that we face, the money is going to be important. But if you want to allow the money to be the driver of saying, do I have enough all the way? Then what you're going to end up doing is you actually will end up isolating yourself away. Because to preserve the money means that you're actually not going to be able to spend it in the way of saying, am I actually creating a space in a community for myself? And realizing that, I realized that song brought out into words what I've been thinking and feeling over the past few years about what to do in that sense. And so
if I understand this correctly, you've got decades of experience in institutional investment, and you're leaning on Jennifer Aniston.
Yeah, exactly.
No. Cheers. Not.
Oh, Cheers.
Not
Sorry,
Cheers.
Ted Danson then.
Yeah.
So sometimes these kind of songs capture very much things which are deep within us, and very often the sitcoms, especially if they run for a long time, because they appreciate something that people feel affinity to. And that element of it is going to become very important in that way. So what that means onto the way when I think of, is it X minus whatever or X divided by whatever in that sense, I actually don't try to think of it as specifically how much do I have that's enough, because I know it's not going to be enough. I see instead, how do I think about, can I get an income? And getting an income requires us to have the openness to take ourselves out a little bit outside of our comfort zones, to be able to do things that we otherwise wouldn't necessarily think of, and to think of what we're able to in terms of what other people may actually need, and for us to step up in that way to do. And I have a friend who's a computer programmer, and during COVID, he was a kind of a freelance computer programmer. His work all dried up. And we met up, and he said, he's doing gardening. And I'm like, oh, you're doing gardening? That's kind of interesting. Why? He says, well, my computer work's all dried up, and I need to get some money. And I know people who know me, they know me enough to say, yeah, come, do this for me. I'll give you a bit of money for it.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to be open to that sort of thing as a base, as kind of like the minimum of that is. Very often we think that we need to reach out and reach up and so on. But when you refuse those sort of things and you try to plan in terms of, do I have my money safe and have I got to invest in all the right places and whatever it is, what happens is you're left with actually nothing that you can rely on. When the story I was telling about the first time I was working in finance and things. I mean, I remember walking to work in an August morning, looking at the billboards outside the tube station with the newspaper headlines and seeing Fed rescue banks and thinking, okay, I can continue the rest of my journey now.
Right. Interesting.
So the community side, the community spirit, like I always think, Steve once said to me, there's no way that like the wealthy friends that we know are going to put their money back into the community, because why would they do that? And I said, because anyone who's earned wealth has earned it at the expense of the planet. And at some point, we've got to recognize that if you do have wealth, it's time to put that wealth back into society so we can address the big problems we've got. And when he sort of said, but why would they do it? I said, because it's their children's future, and I don't think that mindset's kind of sort of there at all, especially in wealth and what we're seeing around it. But the other thing is, that surety of work that you were talking about, when work runs out, you'll go and be a gardener. I think that's another thing, that real adaptability in the future. Like, I know you guys talk a lot about pensions as, we're the only living being on Earth that stops work and then for 20, 30, 40 years live off an accumulation. Whereas I actually think pensioners have got an opportunity to step into the climate. Like every time a 70 plus person says, what more can I do? I think they've got to get involved. They should vote the way the young people want them to vote rather than the way they vote now, for example, right? Because it's about the kids' future, not theirs. What work could they do? Could they be saving the mangroves? Could they be cleaning the beaches? Could they be organising? Could they, all that sort of stuff? And that momentum hasn't happened yet.
No, we've been very privileged, I think, as a generation. I'm speaking broadly here for all of us. You're a bit younger than me and Dave.
Not that much.
We're part of a generation that probably has reaped unparalleled and unprecedented benefits because of the housing boom David is describing. If you started investing in the early 90s or started working, which also means you basically started investing to your pension, you needed to be phenomenally bad decision maker not to build wealth if you had a reasonable income, because you could invest in anything and it's gone up. Tomorrow will not look like that. As most of you have figured out, David is the kind-hearted, optimistic of the two of us, and I'm the cool-hearted bastard, kind of come down like brutal on our future. And I'm inside, I'm actually a really optimistic person. But when I look at the numbers and the facts before me, I can see a very, very bleak near medium term future. And without boring people with a lot of econometric stats, it's like over long time periods, and we're talking multi-generational, 50, 60, 70 years possibly periods, the global GDP, or what we accumulate in growth for the planet, will more or less correlate with the wealth we have. And there are very good reasons for why that is the case. And at the moment, our wealth, as we see it in monetary terms, is about as far above that curve as we have ever seen historically. More so in the late 19th century, when we had a very big crash in property, in particularly in Europe, in sort of 1870s, 1880s. I see no reason, given what's going on, and then you overlay what the climate is going to do to us and our wealth because of how we've been exploiting the planet too far, that relationship is not going back to what it was historically. So I think people will have to find out over the next 10, 20, 30 years that their wealth will not keep growing as it has, and it will probably stagnate is a good scenario and let growth on the planet catch up. That's the optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario is really that climate change moves so fast because it's unchecked and we're not willing to tackle it, that it compounds what is already a kind of natural long-term process, and it brings our wealth down really, really rapidly in an almost uncontrollable manner. That's a really bad scenario for everyone, because then you're going to get a lot of political movements that you definitely don't want to see. I'm probably somewhere in between the two couples you're describing. I moved 3 times country before I was 28. I worked in Stockholm, Brussels, and London, because when you work in the financial industry as a portfolio manager, you can basically not do anything with your own wealth, because trading parallel to what you do in your job is not only a really bad idea, it's also clearly unethical. So what I've saved normally up until recently has been through my pensions and really long-term things that I cannot touch, which has not been a bad thing up until this year, where obviously you will see a fairly big haircut on your wealth. I think, not surprisingly, I'm pretty close to David's view of how you need to look at the future. It's like, I'm fairly convinced that you need less money than you think if you make certain lifestyle choices. And paradoxically, those lifestyle choices will probably be superimposed on you by the climate to some extent. So in some senses, you will perhaps spend less money than you think. On the other side of the equation is the cost of living. That's going to keep going up. Because when you're running out of resources, you are going to get competition, and money is the medium we use for measuring who has the most ability to pay. And that's going to keep on squeezing us from all fronts, because although we could get a fairly significant drop-off in inflation over the next 6 to 12 months, the underlying pressures on resources are not going to go away. So everything you really need will become more costly over the next 10 years. And there's no way out of that. I think for the couples, you need, again, to take the approach that the 500% interest rates taught me, which is always be prepared for kind of extreme scenarios. Obviously, you cannot be totally uninvested in the market and sit on a pile of cash, because it's seldom a good idea. But actually, at the moment, in most countries, cash is yielding something which it hasn't done for 15 years. It's not a bad position to put a reasonable chunk at the moment, because the alternatives to me look really unappealing. I've always had a penchant for gold, because for 5,000 years, it's been the one measure that actually stores wealth in a reasonable, albeit at times volatile fashion. For all the fans of cryptocurrencies, I'm just baffled. I have a lot of sympathy for the underlying idea that you want something that the government can't control really the price of. But if your idea is to opt out of the normal monetary system and create something different that has an independent value of what's going on, I think you're essentially up on a different planet. Because the really extreme scenarios when you would need something very different to store your wealth, I don't think you're going to be able to plug in a computer and get the electricity that actually proves your ownership. You need something that is physically portable, that you can bring with you, because that is kind of the really far out tail Mad Max scenario, when climate change moves so rapidly and you get floods everywhere, you get clear food shortage around the world, and people will start competing not only with money anymore for the remaining resources, but with far more ugly means. in that scenario, I'm sorry, your Bitcoin ain't going to buy you free passage out of here. And though it's a very small risk, that risk is not zero here.
Yeah.
Anyone who sells you that tail in market terms, you should buy that insurance with all you have, because that risk is no longer zero. And that means you need some form of reasonably portable assets. And that's why property is not portable. It's always going to be where it's being held. So if you own property, you'd rather do it in countries that have strong historical respect for private ownership, where it would be a big leap for governments to come in and tax you or expropriate it if you get a regime change, for example.
So in that way, I mean, for myself, for example, I actually view myself as starting from fresh, basically. And I kind of tell my children this, and I say it's not a bad thing to do. We had a conversation early in the year with a person who's a specialist in human nutrition. We were trying to reach out to different people, and actually, it reminds me we want to reach back out to her. And she'd been working in human nutrition around all the different continents of the world for a long time. And this human nutrition, because as she puts it, it's the distribution and the way we use food. It's not about the lack of food. We're famine not because there's not enough food around. It's just that it's not distributed around that. And we have obesity not because somehow that is a problem with food supply. It's just that again, it's the nutritional element of it. But she sort of having worked a long time, and she sort of asked the question, says, what do you think about investments in stock markets and pensions at this point? And I was saying, well, I've taken out cash, and the reason is because I want to start investing again. And this is because a couple of years back, I had a conversation with a colleague who was asking similar things. We were working in the investment industry, and we were looking at the markets, and it all seems extremely bubbly. And I was thinking, well, what you really want to do now is just to bank it and then start putting your chips in again slowly. Because that way, I don't know if this will continue. I'm going to keep adding along slowly, but I certainly don't want everything accumulated to suffer a 50%, 70% drop. And if that seems extreme as a number, I personally don't think so. I personally think that the world we're going to is not my base case of what happens, but I don't want to be taken out when that happens, if that happens.
Right.
So can we? Sorry, I just wanted to say, came to housing, right? Because housing's one where I'll be hanging out with friends and they're doing a second or third round of renovations, and they're really excited about it. And I'm looking at their property going, I reckon this might be under sea by the end of this decade. Is it really worth it? Or, when I was at my sister's place in Melbourne, we were right in the heart of this red zone in Melbourne that was under risk of massive flooding, and it didn't. But I said, where are you above sea level? And they didn't know. So obviously they probably know now. At some point, we talk about stranded assets in the petroleum industry and the oil and gas space, right? But I think at some point soon, the amount of stranded assets that individuals are going to have with properties, the governments aren't going to help them. It's going to get to a point where it's gone too far, right? And you see the predictions, and people argue with them, oh, well, that's not going to happen. I'm like, it's looking like, we're watching Greenland melting at the moment. Thwaites is hanging on by its fingernails, those sort of statements, and this is all predicted in the next few years. Getting even that sort of stuff under control. Like, do you need to sell your property now while you still can? Is that ethical to sell a property that's at risk? But then if somebody isn't doing their research, it's up to them. A lot of people can't sell them because they can't insure them. The banks around the world are finally recognizing the financial risk of the properties they actually do have already. But yeah, what about that? Because property, I think, for the majority of people, is their wealth.
Yes.
Really,
certainly in our part of the world, it's Central Europe has a slightly lower level of home ownership, particularly in Germany, than we have in Anglo-Saxon countries. UK it's pretty extreme actually in how much of household wealth is tied up in property. What you're describing is very much along the lines what David and I think of is the transmission mechanism for how you start chipping away at society and why climate change is likely to bankrupt us before it drowns us. The insurance industry is not stupid. They make a living out of underwriting various types of risks. When they are stepping away from underwriting property insurance or various forms of exports that companies are going to sell stuff to another place, when they withdraw from all these underwriting risks because they see that the climate is really putting everything in jeopardy, pressure is going to come onto local and central governments to fill that void, because that's what the citizens demand. Rightly, I can no longer get house insurance. You need to provide me with this. Governments are going to find very, very rapidly that they're running out of money, something that Liz Truss experienced not many weeks ago. That transmission mechanism can be extraordinarily fast because it's built on one single brick in its foundation, which is confidence. And when that confidence gets eroded, that we no longer have control at policymaker level, then we're going to find very rapidly that house prices can actually come down in a dramatic fashion. Personally, I have, like David described, quite strong libertarian stance on bits of how the economy should operate. You have a free choice to buy wherever you want. You need to do your research. If you like beachfront property and all of a sudden the insurer says, I'm not going to provide you with property insurance, myself as a taxpayer, I have absolutely zero interest in my government underwriting that risk, because you need to be aware of what's happening around you. Unfortunately, I think the first round will be governments trying to fill that void, which will put them into an even bigger, darker, blacker hole financially before they realize that they more or less will have to step away from committing to underwriting everything in society. How that path looks can be very different. But for us, the way we see the world, that's the kind of transmission mechanism, how climate really starts hurting us in more ways than we think of initially. And financially will be, the real boiling point.
So that's already started. I know in New Orleans, the whole insurance industry is basically gone and the government's sort of coming in. So it's already begun. So, from everything we're reading, the escalation, we see it in one part of our country, but then the escalation seems to goes like that. It's not linear. It's, it's massive.
No.
Yeah. Steve, you were going to ask something?
Sorry, I was going to say that, I live in London. We're sufficiently high. Richard is high away from sea level, and we talk about those things. But actually, what we've experienced is actually the flooding comes from rain.
Yeah.
A lot of people are really impacted and affected by it, and so it's a case that it's not even about where you're at sea level in that sense.
Yeah.
You're largely not going to affect it in that way, and this comes to a point where you have to go along and you ask this question, okay, I'm going to move because I want to go somewhere else or whatever it is. How much am I willing to pay for a house, and how much I'm willing to pay for something along? Pricing in property markets in a lot of the places which are like London and so on is still really extreme from what I see. And you kind of have to ask this question, am I willing to walk away from this if things turn out bad? And is this the price I can pay where I can walk away from?
Yeah.
And because the chances are, in the bad scenario of how things work out, you won't find that buyer, or you'll be stuck there for a long time hoping that you find that buyer and go on.
No.
That's kind of the reality of what that investment in property should mean. So it becomes a case that, do I like being in this place? Is this a place that I actually want to go to as a refuge and live there? And that's the part where when people buy property, you mentioned about renovating 3 times and stuff. I live in a place where everyone who gets a place, they renovate it, even though the guy before had just renovated it and had lived there for 6 months before he moved away and flipped the place and so on. So it's like, they clearly not intend on doing anything, but somehow they get an interior designer in, they get it all fantastic, the latest trend and everything else. But that's not really creating the place that they actually want to be in. And for the couple who is kind of like me that I identify with, or the digital nomad in the other side, they both have this sort of question. I went on holiday in the summer. My youngest daughter, who's 11, has a school friend whose parents are Spanish and Italian. And the father is from this part of Italy, Puglia, I think it is, in the southern part of Italy. And we went there. It's the first time I'd been there. It's a beautiful place. And it's relatively cheap in terms of property prices and things still. But what they're saying is they've got all these digital nomads now, especially after COVID, people who are kind of tech people who get, global tech salaries, who can now work remotely. And they find themselves, a place that they really like in that sort of world. And they build for them around it, the environment. Unfortunately, what they're also saying is, because these are people who are very flashy with the money that they have as the extra, is actually pushing up the prices along in places. But the point of it is that there is something about the lifestyle of the digital nomad that in some sense we should be open to. It goes back to this part with Richard and I, with what we do. We want to end up having effectively an education and advisory in some form or another, and in investment, but investment into unscalable things is what I want to do. As part of what we build into our future to help us as we go forward. And we want to be able to do that no matter where we are, by reaching out to people around the world. So the digital nomad, in some sense, is our vision of where we would like to end up as, even though we start off as the other couple.
Right. Interesting.
And because I actually see that as being the more stable part, but within there, I need a local community around me. And I need a local community where I can contribute along. And we talked about, how do you get local energy security? Not kind of like by country, but, I live in the courtyard of 15 houses.
Yeah.
We saw some biomass stuff. We were some people talking about some biomass stuff. And you think, one house alone is not enough. But Richard was saying he saw this in a hotel in Austria. Well, 15 houses is kind of like a hotel. And it works for there. What you need to do is you don't need it to provide all of your energy. You need it to provide sufficient for a baseline of your energy, so that you're not completely exposed to the grid.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And you could plant a garden together as well, right? And,
exactly.
Do compost, the whole thing, right? Really bring it, yeah.
And the thing about planting a garden together is you can go on holiday. Someone else can be watering it for you. Which is really important. Yeah. Because you come back and all your plants have died because it's been very dry that week, right? It's those things that actually says even when I start thinking I'm going to become more like a digital nomad, I want to be a digital nomad in a local community. And with that in mind, I start asking, how do I then look how I want to use the money I have?
Yeah.
Towards building that. And I'm now moving away from the idea of thinking, what's the best stock to invest in? To become actually, how do I really invest in my own future?
Yeah.
And as I start doing that, I end up being able to say, I want to be more vocal with our transformation ownership, to take oil and gas and coal out of financial ownership and put it into stewardship, to start cutting it. Because I can see my own future with more clarity. and that can help me have the courage to take that last step.
Yeah.
So a lot of where we've ended up is we've gone from being the managers of institutional money, where, as I was describing earlier, just before we joined, about how I used to get up at 2 a.m. to check out Asian markets open, get into work before 7 for the European opening, stay up until at least 10 to see how the US closes, and kind of catch sleep and do work in between kind of thing. To actually saying, I've got a certain amount of assets, how do I actually make use of that to invest in my own future, and to do that so that I can have the courage to say, we got to take the hard step. We got to face the world where energy has to be reduced, because we have to reduce oil, gas, and coal, whether we're ready for it or not. And so it is very interesting that COVID has shown that digital nomad in that sense is something that we're all moving somewhat towards.
Yeah.
But what it has also shown equally is where we need that, where I have a friend yesterday. She works in Dubai. She's in Italy at the moment. She's trying to send me something, and she was having such difficulties, as everybody around the world are, with services. You're trying to send something to someone, it costs you so much, you can't get anyone to respond. It's all a bot on the other side, and all of those things. And if you look at that, it actually is saying, you know what, I don't need the speed of an overnight delivery, but I need the contact and the service. So it opens up sort of things about, okay, there are real opportunities for investments, for developing a service that I can do, or I can have people and bring together to do, that is more compatible with what we need for the climate, which is a slowing down of activities.
Yeah.
But we need a quality of activities that puts people at its center. And those are, and we were talking with a young man yesterday who's an engineer, is interested in kind of technology for agriculture and stuff. And he said, he sort of volunteered this aspect of saying, I think he called it, being human-centric.
Yeah.
In that way. So from that perspective, we think about investments, and that resonates with me about what do you actually invest in, and being genuinely human-centric is not Peloton or something like that, which was trying to sell this idea of it, because it doesn't give a place to people to interact with others genuinely, as to say, how can I actually have can I have an umbrella business that actually have, individual personal trainers that can get to know you, to, just watching a video to try and go and do your thing or whatever it is, or compete in that way and so on. So there's that local side, which is going to be very important, but the local side carried out to its extreme makes it very unstable. And you do need that sort of international angle, broader angle. You need to be investing in more ways by which you think you can make a bit of a living. You have contacts with people who know you. There's a reason why they want, and you know that you're valued by them.
Yeah.
And now how you translate that is the challenge that we all face, basically.
Yeah.
Right.
Just got a question from Melbourne. How do you effectively combat misinformation, lack of critical thinking, and people's attitudes? From Clinton.
Wow. David, that's one for you, I think.
Okay. Well, I'll do that, and I'll do that by actually saying, very much that we talked a bit about faith, and faith is, I'd express it as, faith is believe in the future, to have belief in the future, and the element of it being faith is not because of proof in that sense, but for me it comes out of recognizing that there are things which genuinely gives me joy, and those I can hold on to, and that helps me to believe in the future. And I had a conversation with my daughter last night, our elder daughter, who's now just qualified as a doctor, and she's facing this situation where in the UK, in January they're going to have a vote: do they go on strike or not? And she's asking these questions: what do I do? What should I do? And I was saying, I was saying actually, and I told her about this thing which Richard Dawkins, who's an author who wrote things like The Selfish Gene, or about kind of biology and evolution and those sort of things, against sort of where he's saying, you know, nature and evolution can bring about all these complexity and all the rest of it. And he was once asked a question about the eye, and it was like, the question was, how can something so intricate, so complex, that has such kind of designed functionality, come at random? And he said, you don't look at the eye at the moment as what it is. Just think what difference it has to you to be able to distinguish between dark and light. So if you close your eyes and you look to one side of the room and then you look to the other, and you can't see any of the features, but if you can distinguish between dark and light, that's a huge step. That allows you to take a small step along into a direction which you wish to be, whether it's to the dark or to the light. And that's really important in terms of combating the misinformation and everything else. Because we get caught into parts where we want to prove all the details and stuff. Whereas really what we want to do is actually just to say between the dark and the light. You know, you take climate change and says, is it important? Is it happening? Where are your proof and all the rest of it? And for me, it's simply a case of saying, does it feel different?
Yeah.
If it feels different, take that next step.
Yeah.
Start from thinking of those things.
Yeah.
If you want to get into all the details and start thinking about in those details, what happens is you end up in traps where ultimately you end up with this part of saying, can I prove something? But if you actually take it back at the point of saying, can I feel it? Do I feel that difference? Is there dark and a light along? Just very simply in that way. Is it a bit darker here? Is it a bit lighter? Does it feel darker if I go down this path? Does it feel lighter if I go down this path? It lets you take those small steps along. And it lets you take people along with you in that way too. Because they can feel it in that way too.
Yeah.
So can I ask a question on that? Just following forward.
Can I just quickly add to this? Because, you know, misinformation is something I talk about, right? So one of the reasons I do the weekly reads is to share everything I'm reading, but it's also about saying, here's lots of different perspectives on lots of different media. So the first thing is, you're not going to stop misinformation. The social media channels need to stop it. The media houses need to stop it, but they're not going to stop it because that's how they're making money, and that's a business problem with the press.
Yeah.
So I always say, like, we've just got to share information. Like, if all of the good people in the world who know what they're talking about, the experts who know what they're talking about, if we're all out there sharing information, it's a way of tackling it. We're not going to stop it. Lack of critical thinking, all we can do is demonstrate critical thinking, and then people's attitudes. You know, so I've had people that I grew up with say, well, I'm not noticing anything with climate change. And I'm like, okay, let's just look at it from this perspective. Where we grew up, it was very, very rare to hit 40 degrees, very rare in a summer. Now we're in the mid 40s, and based on global warming, that area will hit 50. Is that not proof enough? You know, just look over the span of your life of what's actually happened. You know, 70% of all life, you know, has gone. You know, we've taken away the habitat, or, you know, going towards extinction. So, I mean, the evidence, the proof is out there, but don't fight with people who want to fight. Talk to people who want to talk, but don't fight with people who want to fight, because they're not interested in talking. That's my experience.
No, it's you want to fight the battles that you can win and save your energy and resources for those. But what's important, I think, what's helping the bright side of community in the world is that actually technology is here very, very helpful. It's much easier today than just 10 years ago to access a lot of information if you really want to find it. The internet has done wonders for your ability to actually get hold of the stuff that you want to read from the sources you trust because of who they are. But don't waste energy and your own good health fighting people that clearly are not going to listen. It's a waste of time, I think.
Sure.
I know how much I do to acquire my knowledge. If someone who wants to argue with me has spent no time acquiring knowledge and they just have an opinion, I'm just like, it's okay. You go and do what you need to do. I'm doing what I need to do. And sorry, Steve, you were going to say something?
No, I was just going to pick up on one of the last things that you said there, David, which actually leads really nicely into my final question for both of you. And you were saying, if you see change, take action. Yeah. Do you think institutional investment houses are seeing this change? Are they quietly divesting of this?
It's a really difficult question in many ways, because institutional investing is very constrained by its fiduciary duty that is set under regulations. So when people call on them and say, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that, they face shackles on one side.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other, they also recognize the things which people don't generally see. 82.2% of our energy in 2021 came from oil, gas, and coal. Part of the reason why we have this cost of energy issue is because of the lack of investments within the oil, gas, and coal. Because imagine you got a car, you've had it for 15 years, it's running to a point where it takes money to go along and repair. You're not allowed to buy a new one. You're not allowed to repair it. It's going to cost you more and more to run it.
Right.
So they see the problem of being put onto the side of saying, I'm not allowed to buy a new one. I'm not allowed to repair it. And somehow I'm going to make investments, provide this for cheaper and cheaper. And on the other side, I can't get rid of this thing because I have my fiduciary duties along with it.
Right. No, I totally get that. I just wonder, I think Deutsche hit the headlines, I think it was 15, 16 years ago. Correct me if I'm wrong. They were one of the first to announce a green fund. Does that sound, was it Deutsche? It was, right. Okay. I wonder if anyone is going to stand up and have one of those courageous kind of moments and go, you know what, ethically, we need to go down this path. I mean, it will be financial suicide probably. I wonder if we're going to get to that point, or as I say, are institutions already taking measures against that and kind of slowly divesting of that side of things?
Well, I'd like to take the opportunity to take it into our transformation ownership, basically, if I may. And of all the reporting numbers and everything else, there's only one thing we need to watch, which is just the amount of oil, gas, and coal we're producing. And that's increasing along every year. So it doesn't matter whether you declare yourself to be green. It doesn't matter where you go along and you say, I should produce renewable energy or whatever it is. It's the total that matters. As long as that total is not decreasing, the total amount of oil, gas, and coal that we're using is not decreasing, the total amount of oil, gas, and coal that we're producing is not decreasing, we are all greenwashing. Because at 82% of our energy in the world coming from oil, gas, and coal, the medicine you take, all the active pharmaceutical ingredients are basically made in China. All the generic drugs are basically made in India. And as everybody from the climate side says, these are the worst countries in the world because of the coals and so on, of the use of coal or that. Part of the reason for all those things is because to make medicine needs a lot of energy. So when you go for your painkiller just so that you can go back to work or whatever it is that you take, or your vitamins that you do, you're greenwashing away.
Yeah.
And the only way to deal with that, the only way to wrap around it well, is by taking the financial interest out of ownership of oil, gas, and coal, buy them up. You can't allow oil, gas, and coal to be used for free. So take the profit from the energy companies, from the oil, gas, and coal producing companies, and give them back to everybody affected by climate change. Then you become an owner with no financial interest. Make that owner everybody. Make that owner everybody who spends money. Because everybody who spends money is part of the pressures as to why we have to keep using oil, gas, and coal. Right. But we are now owners without any of the financial interest. And we can now go along and call our businesses and say, we are owners of these resources for energy that we all need. But you say you've committed to net zero by 2050. Join us by contributing a part of the money we spend with you so that we can buy up these assets. And we're going to cut its production to your 2050 target. And if you're not greenwashing, use the energy supplied by this. Because if you don't, and you're using the other guys who's not cutting the production, you are now clearly greenwashing. And those that use this clearly are not. And you allow this distinction to be made between genuinely an ecosystem of businesses and people and governments who put their money where their mouth is.
Yeah.
And others who want to put a green label on it and says, I'm going to keep using suppliers that will keep providing. And in doing so, you transform the whole debate into action that individuals can take.
Right.
And so to the case of Deutsche or BlackRock or those people, then it becomes, are you supporting this? Are you calling on all the companies actually saying, we will invest in you because you are going to take part of the revenues that people spend and put it into this transformational ownership, making the people who spend the money the transformational owners so that they have the ownership rights over the company as shareholders and all of those things. But in doing so, committing to buying up the oil, gas, and coal companies, distributing all the profits back out to people directly. And that's a huge amount of money. I mean, last year, that was $120 billion in terms of the dividends that came out. That's more than the climate fund that supposedly they're trying to get. And this year, probably 2 or 3 times that, considering the difference in pricing that we have had. And that works out last year to $14 per person. You know, a school class of, you know, my daughter's school has, you know, about 30 people in her class. You know, at $14 each, just kind of like what, $420 that they can have to do something, whatever that might be, whatever it is that helps them to live their lives, to do what we were talking about, you know, help the community to contribute along in that way. It might be, you know, life's so hard, we just need to have a bit of a party. It might be, you know, that can help us to be able to have that biomass, you know, off-grid generation, and just a little bit of contribution that gets it started in that way. And if you are living in, I was in conversation with some people who are trying to walk to COP 27 at the moment, and they need a bit of funding, by the way. And I can send a link later and so on. They just need a bit of funding to make that last trip. They're a group of people from sub-Saharan Africa wanting to go to COP27 and tell their stories. And for them in their communities, having that money for them in places of the world where $14 makes a huge difference for each individual is really the kind of aspect of climate justice that people talk about. But it's direct. It doesn't have to go through layers of institutions and layers of kind of transactions and things. It allows people to say, you know best what you need. And this would give you a little bit of a helping hand. And in doing so, you're committing to supporting us cutting the production of oil, gas, and coal, even if we're not ready.
Yeah, and it's not. We can't just turn it off, right? It's got to go down. But the fact that it isn't, so I would definitely recommend Unsustainable Truth to understand what David's talking about with this transformational ownership. It's to me, it's one of those ideas that is needed for this time, and it's very, very simple. But no one's really looking at it, and we're seeing some of the oil and gas assets being sold off to some of the players we don't want them sold off to. But it's just really one final question, and then we'll wrap it up. Pensions are a huge part of your book, and I know that's an area you've both worked in. And I was actually shocked by what I was reading, like the vineyards in France, or, I saw there's a UNESCO World Heritage wetlands in Spain that's been drained so that they could water the strawberries, right? So it's gone. We're tying perpetual growth to things that can never guarantee perpetual growth because weather, right? I was a bit shocked by that. But so beyond the damage that's being caused by the way pensions are being run, what is the future for pensions? Is it even worth investing in a pension? I mean, I'm looking at lots of stuff going on in the UK around pensions. I don't get it. I know you do. Are pensions going to collapse? Is that nest egg that everyone thinks they've got going to be impacted? We've seen, my dad had to work for a couple more years because of a recession that chipped away at his pension. We've seen that, but are we talking about something a lot more drastic now?
Yes and no. I think pensions are important. It's something that you should have, and you should save continuously, because you are not going to be able to retain your earning stream all through your life unless you sadly die prematurely. As you get older, it's kind of important, like we mentioned, that if you can find any source of revenue, it helps you, it helps the community and society at large. The over-reliance on pensions is what we're describing normally as being the only human beings who actually hoard resources for part of our life and then contribute nothing at the end. It's a bit unnatural. And I think what you see happening with markets coming off this year is making people realize that you cannot solely rely on this nest egg to see you through to your dying days. Like I described earlier, there are pretty good reasons for why you should not expect fantastic returns from here on. And actually, people are a bit shocked by how much markets have declined this year. My sobering thought there would be you're still quite far above trend if you look at like multi-century graphs. So there's all the possibility and even probability you can come off further in some respects, which would make pensions decline. We're not anti-pensions. I'm certainly not anti-pension, but you cannot, again, it goes back to your risk management approach. If your whole life is depending on it at one point in the future, you're in trouble, because more likely than not, there will be impairments for you. Young people should start saving early. They should always put money away for this long-term investment plan, because if you can't access the money, you can actually look really long-term, which is a good thing. But we need to step away from our over-reliance on having to reach number X at a certain point in our time where we can put our feet up and stop contributing to society. It's not healthy for us. It's certainly not healthy for our communities and our society. And I think from that perspective, the decline we've seen in pension plans will be a wake-up call for people, whether it means you need to, like you described, work a couple of years more, or just rethink our whole relationship to our anchor investments for the future, which the pension very much is. Because the flip side of this will be going forward as well, that governments, again, will step away from some of the commitments they have in the public pension plans UK, we're looking at the so-called triple lock and what that means. And it's pretty clear governments are going to run out of money, so there will be impairments anyway. So it's better for yourself, your community, and society at large if you start figuring out how can I keep contributing in some meaningful way further on in life.
I think, I have 3 children who are in their 20s, and I tell them, expect to be working till you're 100. Let that guide you as to how you think your work needs to be. Let that guide you as to how you think your savings need to be, and what you think investments ought to provide to your world, because you're going to be working till you're 100. I think that's the reality of what.
I saw a climate scientist the other day saying a child born today will have a life expectancy of 30 to 40 years, and the majority of that life will be miserable. So we're seeing that sort of extreme prediction as well. So what's the point, right? That's
actually, I think that's where climate science sometimes ends up picking what are the scenarios which are so far out of reach in terms of people's lifetimes. It's not that that's necessarily a wrong prediction, but that's not going to be the prediction of my children in that way. And we've still got a degree of buffering left in our economies that's going to do its best to try and make sure that doesn't quite happen. For people like ourselves, there are people born today in parts of the world where their parents had a life expectancy of 30, and theirs is actually the same or worse, and so on. So that's certainly true in certain situations in certain places. But the reality of what we're likely to see and what we want to achieve, and that's the important difference between them, is a world where our children will likely live to 100. But they will be contributing actively in that way. You've got a nice tree in your garden. You don't expect it somehow to stop contributing to being a nice tree in your garden and spend 30 years after that, and after 60 years being around, and then spend 30 years just basically not contributing anymore. Not effectively providing the shelter and everything that it does to the things around it. And that's the distinction. If we're going to manage along, we have to recognize a few things. Is that the world has changed, and one of the ways in which it has changed is, we're 8 billion people in the world. That's room enough for 8 billion people in the world if we are different. We don't all try to be the same. But what it does mean is that the way in which we could exploit the planet before is no longer available for 8 billion people in that way. So the planet is an integral partner now with us. It's like growing up and being part and contributing to a community, to family in that way, rather than just sort of being supported by it. And pensions is a huge part of that, because investments need resources. Resources drain the planet. And if you look at it as I'm building up resources so that I can live a secure life without having to work every day in that sort of way, then you're going to be draining those resources and taking them away from other people coming on who need those resources too.
Yeah.
And that's the difficulty of pensions. There is no room for pensions as we think of it in the world we're going to, because there are more and more people thinking of wanting that pension. The number of middle class, aspiring middle class, looking to that as a way for them to stop having to work along is not within the capacity what our planet can provide.
Yeah.
No.
All right. Three quick tips from both of you, what everyone should do. Go. For me, I'm just all about staying agile. That's what I keep saying to Steve. Let's just stay agile, pay attention, be ready to move if we have to. try and make the right decision in time. If understand the threats, how far out they are, and if they come closer, that sort of thing. So, what do you recommend?
Well, I think we go back to the one we always have, right? Which is slow down, do less, and don't panic.
Yeah, panic is a very bad thing to do. You normally never take good decisions when you do so. But the only thing I would add is we are fragile in our economies because we have no buffers, and makes our resilience low. And we talked earlier about the need to have more localized energy generation, etc. We need more of that thinking and rebuilding our natural robustness and resilience. So you make sure you have some stuff at home. You can't come home and have an empty fridge. Have a couple of packs of pasta around so you always can eat, because supermarket shelves are going to go empty every now and then. Those small things that we have been grown accustomed to because we've been so privileged that everything is always readily available at the flick of a switch. The world has changed. It won't be like that. It means on an individual level, you actually need to have a little bit of buffer. In my sense, it's like it might not go to 500% when they hike rates, but you need to be prepared that things can go much worse than you initially imagine. Can you stay in the game and not be literally kicked out? That for me is kind of essential in how you structure your own resilience against adverse events. And like you described, be agile. The world is changing very, very rapidly.
So keep pushing your comfort zone. Just keep gently tapping it, and just keep gently tapping your comfort zone. That helps you to just open your eyes.
I think that's really good advice. I'm so concerned by the amount of people not doing that, and I'm concerned when the moment comes, what that's going to do to them. And that's we're all trying to raise awareness, right?
Yes.
Okay, so soon, when you guys give me a date, I'm going to host a live conversation with David and Richard on my Uncommon Courage Facebook group, where you can ask them anything, you can talk about anything. They're really open, really honest. So I'll let you know when that's happening. The next no-show will be on the 18th of November, because next week we're celebrating our Lexi's 16th birthday. Oh, I can't believe we've got a 16-year-old and we're going to go and see Guns N' Roses. So he's very excited.
Wow.
So, the next Climate Courage is going to be on the 25th of November. And I haven't decided what it's going to be about yet, but I've got so many topics. So I don't think I'm ever going to run out. But Richard and Dave, thank you so much for joining me again. It's always really, really valuable to listen to you and what you've got to say. And thanks, Steve. And any more clarity for you?
So what I'm taking away from my new friend Richard is expect the best, plan for the worst.
You love that.
As an engineer, that's what we live and die by. And David, you talk about buffer, so we call that a factor of safety. So I never realised that civil engineering was so closely aligned to the financial services market. So thanks for that, guys. I actually feel a little bit smarter than just a builder now.
So much more. All right. No, I really appreciate it. Hope it's been useful for everybody. I think just we've got to start paying attention. This is happening. It's escalating. There are real risks to all of us, wherever we are in the world. And, if you can prepare, you can plan and prepare, right?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
All right. I'm going to end the broadcast. See you guys.